Have you been looking for Memory Palace examples? If so, you're in the right place. I've got 5 kinds of Memory Palace types you can experiment with, including practice tips and even a bit of a warning about the deadly force of apps and software that you probably want to avoid. But to get started, I need you to understand something essential. Every memory technique is related to the Memory Palace technique, method of LOCI, journey method, Roman rooms, etc. This point might be hard to grasp at first, especially with so many terms floating around. But this fine little detail is really important. The Memory Palace is not what it seems. Yes, it's based on buildings that you've either seen or invented, but there's more. It's based on the same core foundational principle that governs all information. This principle is space. You see, your brain encodes information chemically in the brain, and according to Stephen Kosslyn, there's a kind of one-to-one correspondence between information out in the world and where your brain stores it, in the brain.
And you can see that the right part of this pattern is physically laid out on cortex. This is the left cortex, so the right visual field goes to the left part of the brain and vice versa. So this is truly depictive in the way that I've defined it. If you have a hole in an area, which I don't recommend, but sometimes these happen, you'll get a scotoma, a blind spot, in the corresponding part of the visual field. If you have 2 holes in the cortex, the 2 scotomas will be positioned in space relatively far apart, depending on how far apart the 2 holes are. I mean, it's using space on cortex to represent space in the world, such that points on cortex, the distance between the points corresponds distance between the objects.
I suggest you read his book, The Case for Mental Imagery, and you can follow it up with a very powerful lecture he gave in one of his videos. If we were to boil everything I've learned from Kosslyn down to one core principle that has helped me the most, it is this. Your brain is kind of like a Memory Palace book. Now hear me out. Imagine that your brain really was a book, and each page of that book is covered in words. Now imagine that each page in that book is a neural network that binds all of its words together. Where? In space, of course. Likewise, the neural networks in your brain bind the neuronal chemicals that store your memories. Where? I know it's obvious, but it's also worth repeating. In space. Where else? Of course, the brain and memory are much more complex than any metaphor or analogy can express, and space itself is just a word that appears in the mind, a mind generated by the brain, a collection of cells that itself occupies space and uses space to transmit all kinds of signals. And why does any of this matter? Well, think of it this way. If a book is an information storage and retrieval device that uses the space of pages, then the computer version of books do pretty much the same thing. And this fact means that something like your Kindle app also stores each word in space on a hard drive and a screen. And so if you think about how your books and apps relate to your memory, the ultimate Mind Palace app is your brain. Isn't that exciting? I sure think so. And that's why I produce so much Memory Palace training for the world. It's also why I help people simplify the process so it doesn't look so freaking complex, like the example from hundreds of years ago you see now on your screen. It's that kind of example that people find a lot when they search the internet, but we can create a Memory Palace within minutes, if not seconds. So let me ask you, which of the following 5 Memory Palace options is most attractive to you? Pick one and let me know in the discussion below. And while you're down there, hit the thumbs up and get subscribed if you're new here. This is Dr. Anthony Metivier from MagneticMemoryMethod.com, and I'm so excited to help you master the Memory Palace. Why? Because when you can memorize just one thing, you can memorize all that you want. You just need to be strategic about it and use the best tools at your disposal. Exactly the kind of tools we talk about right here on this channel. Welcome to 5 Memory Palace examples to improve your memory training practice. Number 1. The bird's eye third person Memory Palace. This kind of Memory Palace involves looking down through the roof on a building. It's literally as if you're looking down at a floor plan. The best way to get it down in a few minutes or less? Draw it by hand. As you can see, I've done just that, and I've done this hundreds of times to rapidly create vast Memory Palace networks. Why draw them out? Because it helps your mind understand and remember the memory palace using the levels of processing effect. You see it outside of your mind and use mental rotation to, so to speak, set it and forget it. Skip drawing your memory palaces at your peril. But with a small amount of practice, you can use this simple technique to memorize anything, including vocabulary or even an entire speech. In fact, my good friend and fellow memory expert Jonathan Levy did just that after I showed him how to do so for his TEDx presentation. This is the memory palace he used. I recently gave a TEDx presentation myself from memory, and I've got a course all about memorizing speeches inside the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass. It's so much fun, it's fast, and really easy to do. Without a memory palace, it's hard and frustrating. Why not choose the easy path? Basically, the process is simple. Select a location suited to creating a memory palace, usually a familiar building, but parks and other locations will do. Get out a sheet of paper, ideally in a memory journal, devoted to memory palace creation. Draw the memory palace, strategically structure your course through the memory palace, practice it mentally, and use it to memorize something by drawing upon the tools of magnetic association. If you're stuck on what locations to use, I have a free training called How to Find Memory Palaces. It will help. Link below. If you need help with creating the imagery, then I've got a bunch of elaborative encoding and visualization exercises that should be useful to you too. But don't just gobble down the content or hoard it as data for later. Everybody knows that someday never comes. Get the free course at magneticmemorymethod.com and start studying and putting it into action now, today, without delay. And I suggest you try each of these memory palace styles, which brings us to 2, the second person memory palace. In this kind of memory palace, you look at yourself or a magnetic bridging figure move through your memory palace as if through the lens of an external camera. This is not a replacement for drawing the memory palaces, but a different way of thinking and experiencing the navigation process. There's a lot more to say about this particular technique, so go through a course called the MASTERPLAN in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass whenever you want more information. 3, we have the first person memory palace. Using this kind of memory palace, here's what happens. You imagine yourself in the memory palace, you then imagine yourself seeing the journey you are following through your own eyes. You can also pretend to be a character in a video game, series, or movie and see through the eyes of that character. For example, using an outdoor memory palace, I could imagine being this Giordano Bruno statue and see parts of Rome I've created as a memory palace as if through his eyes. Personally, it's rare that I use this technique because I don't have much of a mind's eye. Recently, it's switched on and now it comes and goes, but I actually prefer to live without it. For those of you dealing with aphantasia, it might be more of a blessing than a curse, but if you're interested in my full story, check out my interview on Aphantasia Meow's channel, and rest assured, I'm not the only one who uses memory techniques happily and well without seeing images in my mind. And when it comes to this style of memory palace, it is possible. You just have to draw on other aspects of your imagination, some of which don't actually have words to describe. But when you dive into the practice and get proper training from someone you know, like, and trust, magnetic friends, you'll feel it and know exactly what I mean. 4, the virtual memory palace. At a fundamental level, all memory palaces are virtual memory palaces. Why? You are creating an imaginary construct. We base this construct on buildings or areas we've seen in real life. We navigate it virtually in our imagination. This point comes up in a big way in a book called The Art of Memory by Francis Yates. It's in chapter 12, when Yates analyzes a debate between the idea that memory should be practiced purely on the basis of logic with no mental imagery involved whatsoever. As one of the defenders of using logic without mental imagery says, and here I'm paraphrasing, "If you say your memory palaces are true, then you are lying." Well, magnetic friends, what is truth? And who amongst us can be so certain that the world appearing in front of you is what it seems? If you're interested in the philosophical and historical aspects of the memory palace, make sure to check out our community's playlist on the Art of Memory for more discussion like this, and I promise that if you read the Art of Memory along with us, you'll find plenty that improves your practice. Should you be interested in these matters? In a word, yes. You really are robbing yourself of the full power and glory that comes from a memory practice guided by the fullest possible understanding of the tradition. Back to practical matters in the here and now. When you're basing a memory palace on a location you've seen with your own eyes, you seriously reduce cognitive load. Go back to Kosslyn if you're interested in the scientific why and how. When you invent new memory palaces or base them on movies, well, I can't speak for everyone under the sun, but for a lot of us, that's just way more work than is necessary. And in part 2 of the Art of Memory series, I suggest that a man named Giordano Bruno, who many think was telling you to invent virtual memory palaces, was actually saying just the opposite. I, like Bruno, many hundreds of years ago, suggest you lower the load, and to do that, I suggest you follow along with me for a little mental experiment. When you last moved into a new home, did you have to work hard to memorize the layout? Probably not. Spatial memory takes care of memorizing the layout on autopilot. That's what makes calling it to mind so easy. But if you're using a video game as a memory palace, not only do you have to learn the layout in a completely different way, you don't physically navigate it in quite the same way you would with your full sensory capacities. There's no smell of the kitchen, no love for that favorite food in the fridge, and certainly not its taste, at least not yet, though signs are showing that neural implants might force it upon you soon enough. Don't go chasing after that level of corporate control at the deepest cellular level. Word to the wise, that's going to require a whole new definition for the word slavery. Again, I speak this with a note of caution. This cognitive overload that I experience when using video game memory palaces may not be true for all people. But I think for most of us, virtual memory palaces cost more time and energy than they are worth. That said, Idris Zogai shares some wisdom on the practices of invented memory palaces that you might find useful. That discussion is available only on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. 5. The Magnetic Memory Palace. This kind of memory palace lets you fuse all of the first 4 approaches together into one seamless memory palace strategy. Recall rehearsal also makes memory practice feel a lot like a memory palace game. In fact, when you use the magnetic memory method tools of seashelling, the pillar technique, ample use of magnetic bridging figures, recall rehearsal, and the big 5 of learning, which is also called the levels of processing, everything gets much easier, and that's because it becomes much more fun. Not only that, but the magnetic memory palace, when used as part of a full memory palace network, makes recall rehearsal faster and easier. Recall rehearsal, in case you're unfamiliar with it, is a fast and fun memory game, a way to get any information into long-term memory quickly. Now, you might be wondering which of these memory palace approaches are best for studying and learning. Ultimately, you need to experiment, and I would suggest that you learn to use a magnetic memory palace as quickly as possible. Then learn how to renovate a memory palace. Some options we talked about today require too much time and energy, and you'll spend more time visualizing your memory palace and your journey through it than necessary. So please, always remember that memory champions simply don't have time to muck around too much with their memory palaces. I never did either for my studies, and to this day, rarely spend more than 2 to 5 minutes planning them out. And I don't know about you, but I simply don't have time for adding undue cognitive load to the process. Anyone can learn to reduce the need to visualize their memory palaces and journeys with just a bit of practice, and drawing them out so they're well planned saves you time on fixing mistakes later that could have been avoided. Now, what about memory palace apps? There are a few memory palace software programs available. Memory Filer is one of the more interesting ones, but as every app creator I've interviewed ultimately admits, all memory apps present a deviation from developing true memory skills. What kind of skills? The Giordano Bruno memory skills of legend we cover in the Art of Memory series. Even before Bruno, for thousands of years, people memorized entire books without apps or programs. In fact, it might be precisely because computers have created digital amnesia that people no longer pick up these high-level memory skills more often. For research purposes, I've spent a lot of time in memory palace training with apps. This activity has always been interesting, but ultimately always a waste of time. Here's why. When you train your memory to use a memory palace with an app, you're training in a digital environment. And if you want to remember, for example, names at events, that will give you a bit of an advantage. But just remember, the only memory palace examples that matter involve the practice memorizing names at real events or in real situations, unassisted by technology. I never once was allowed to look at an app when I was completing an exam or speaking in a foreign language. What you need to remember is there in memory, or it isn't. And I have found that training with apps reduces my skills instead of increasing them. And little wonder, real life events do not take place on apps. They happen in the world. Just ask Jesse Villalobos about how he got a promotion, featured on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast for your listening pleasure. How to practice the memory palace technique. This is a great question. I suggest that you start with just one magnetic memory palace network first, then create another one until you fully feel the effects of spatial memory working its magic in your mind. What makes for the perfect memory palace network? 26 memory palaces, please. It's easier than you think if you just get your mindset straight and let an ancient tool I teach you how to use guide the way in the free course at magneticmemorymethod.com. You'll begin to sense exactly why the memory palace in combination with this special tool is the most powerful technique and why all the other techniques, including the major method, are all spatial in nature. For more memory palace examples, hit thumbs up, get subscribed, and then let me know in the comments below if you have thoughts or questions. You got this, my friends in memory, and until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.